Welcome back to the Million Dollar Landscaper Podcast. Now, we understand that it's very hard to find employees nowadays, and we go through all kinds of hassles to get new employees, to keep employees. But did you know there's an alternative out there? And one of the alternatives is using the H-2B program. And I know some of you may have tried it, had some struggles with it. And today we're excited to bring on Nataly Mualem of that Mualem firm, and they're going to go through and talk a little bit about the H-2B program and how to kind of get going with that. So welcome, Nataly. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Nataly, you mind sharing a little bit about yourself and your firm and what you exactly do?
Sure. So, as you stated, my name is Nataly Mualem, and I have been out of law school for about 8 years now. And the entire time I've been focused on employment-based immigration. I worked at several different firms in the past, including, very small firms, boutique firms, and a very large immigration firm as well. And the entire time I tried to focus on employment-based immigration because I felt like for me, that was giving me the best of both worlds. As somebody who was an immigrant myself, I felt like I was helping immigrants every day, but at the same time, also helping business owners. My new firm now focuses primarily on the H-2B program, but also I, dabble in other employment-based immigration from things that I have experience with. And I'm trying to, kind of create a new model for the H-2B law firm in which we, heavily focus on customer service, customized plans for every single client, and making sure that all the strategic advantages of the H-2B program are fully utilized as well.
Awesome. So I know you said that you were an immigrant. Is that something that's kind of drew in a little even more just because you were an immigrant yourself?
Yes, definitely. So my family and I immigrated here when I was only 5 years old. And, we had a long immigration journey in order to, finally get here. It did take, I would say about 20 years for us to finally arrive here. And, one of the things that I learned along the way is how unforgiving the immigration programs are in the United States. So it's, so essential to have somebody that is advocating for you, that knows what they're talking about, that knows how to represent you or your company very well. And I think that's something that I, try to draw on every day, and, also realize how the immigration program affects, the employers' lives and the employees' lives. And, that it's not just pushing papers, but actually, advocating for our clients in the best way.
Awesome. So I guess before we dive too deep into the HB program, would you mind just kind of going over, just give us like an overview of what the HB program exactly is and kind of just a brief idea of how it works?
Sure. So, the idea of the H-2B program is the government has realized that seasonal programs or seasonal work is harder to fill by domestic labor. If a domestic employee has the option between something year round and something that, has fluctuating needs, 9 times out of 10, they're going to be choosing the job that is permanent versus the temporary and seasonal one. So in order to fill this gap, knowing that, traditionally the US has low unemployment rates anyway, one way to address it was to allow the introduction of foreign employees for a limited duration. So the H-2B program, basically does that. It allows employers to bring workers for a temporary period. It could be reoccurring. So there's several different categories under H-2B that you can file. One of them is seasonal, meaning that there's, certain months out of the year where you have absolutely no work, which, I see a lot in landscaping in certain areas. Or it could be peak load, meaning that you do have work year round, but there is a kind of a documented need for certain months out of the year where that increases. And typically we say about 15 to 20% increase at least. Or there's a one-time occurrence where there's a project that is, very basically as the name implies, that's very unique and perhaps is only going to happen once or twice in the history of the company. So they allow the company to bring in workers for that need. And then there's also intermittent need where, there's certain events that trigger the need and you can't really guess when it's going to happen. Like think of disaster relief or something like that. We don't know when next big hurricane is going to hit, essentially. So those kind of cleanup efforts typically fall under that program. But generally, H-2B is designed so that you're able to fill temporary gaps with foreign workers.
So I didn't realize there's all those different types of categories. That's pretty interesting. Now, I know you mentioned like landscaping is one of the people that actually apply for or can apply for this. Is there certain businesses that can or cannot apply for the H-2B program?
Sure. So the only real requirement in terms of what industries is that they cannot be agricultural. And the definition of agricultural kind of has been changing as new case law emerges. But agricultural work in general has to be filed under the H-2A program. And then H-2B is everything that is non-agricultural. There's no real limit to what types of industries can apply, but around 50% of those visas do end up going to landscaping companies, and then other major industries include construction and hospitality and some manufacturing, seafood processing, things like that. So, generally speaking, no. And I've had definitely one-off cases where it's not an industry you'd expect. Like I've done hair salons, nail salons, things that are untraditionally seasonal, but just because of how they fall geographically, they do become seasonal. But most of the businesses tend to be in those three categories, being construction, landscaping, and hospitality.
Okay. Just kind of curious. So, if a landscaper also has like a tree nursery where they grow trees, is that under A or would that be under B, or is that a
So
line that's kind of weird?
So most of the time, depending on what they're doing, it could be under A or B. We've definitely done tree nurseries under H-2B before, and that just depends on the growing, the growing. Methods that they're using, what these workers are doing. Like, for example, soil sampling, where it's somebody that's actually going out in the field, we've argued actually is H-2B before, because even though they are collecting samples in the field, the primary point of the whole process is not, an agricultural component of the business. It's actually analysis that happens behind the scenes. And then, in other instances, there's been farm labor contractors, which have argued the opposite. So, they're building structures on farms, and they're saying, even though we are, practicing construction, this is still H-2A, because we are, essentially, on a farm. So there's definitely different ways, and the law is fluctuating on that. And actually, there's been recent cases addressing that issue of what is a farmer and who's exempt from the overtime rules that apply to H-2A workers or farmers in general. So there's been a lot of issues about that. What I would say is, we'd need to look very closely at the job description before we can really analyze what program suits the job best.
Gotcha. And I know you mentioned too earlier about the like seasonality. Now, I when we first started talking to each other, you mentioned being able to hire people even just for the winter time for snow season. I didn't realize that was like, to me, it never crossed my mind, but that's another option though, correct?
Correct. Actually, many of our landscaping clients do also participate in the winter season, and it actually ends up creating a strategic advantage, because what happens is you have a snow season that begins after October. So the workers, because of the way that the system is set up, the year resets every October 1st instead of every January 1st. And what ends up happening is, because of the October 1st start date, the workers are exempt all throughout the next year. So in April, when everybody is, fighting for those coveted 33,000 visas, your workers are exempt from that because they came in October. So many of the H-2B clients that do participate in landscaping are having a separate snow season now.
Gotcha. So, would you mind kind of going over what the application process? What does a typical landscaper have to do? What do they need to do to kind of get that process going?
Sure. So, at least in my firm, the initial step is always a consultation that involves some intake. So we talk about your season, what does your labor need look like? Because maybe if you only need one or two employees, maybe the H-2B program isn't the best fit. We talk about what times that you're experiencing peaks, what documentation you have, contracts that you may already have secured for the upcoming year. And then the next step, if we decide the H-2B program is a good idea, the next step is filing what's called a prevailing wage request. And what that is we have to request from the Department of Labor what wage they set as the minimum for that occupation in that location. So we provide basic company information, and then we also give a job description, any requirements that we're requiring of our applicants. So if you need certain months of experience, or they have to know how to use certain tools, then that all factors into it as well. And then we also give them the location and how many areas of intended employment you have, because it has to be within a defined area for H-2B, or we have to have multiple applications if it's very spread across. And after that, it usually takes anywhere from 6 weeks. We get what's called a prevailing wage. And that's done through the Department of Labor. They have surveys of similarly employed people, and they decide what that minimum wage has to be. And the idea is we don't want to set our wage so low that, we're basically forcing US workers out of the competition. So that's really the motivation behind it. Sometimes those wages do come back a little bit higher than we intended, and we can change the job description a little bit, or maybe limit locations and refile. But typically the idea is, we want to make it fair that, we're not saying that we'd prefer to spend less on labor. We're saying we can't find labor. And then afterwards, we
Mhm.
collect all the documents needed, including payroll, sometimes revenue reports, depending on what we have to show our seasonality in the past and to show that we truly are seasonal. Sometimes those arguments are simple as weather information. Others, we have years of payroll that we can present. And we put together a statement of need. We have the employer review their rights and responsibilities as an H-2B employer and sign off on those. We find a recruiter if we need one. And on the 90-day mark before you need your workers, we would then submit the TLC, or the temporary labor certification. For first-time employers, a lot of time that ends up of you basically getting what's called a notice of deficiency, asking for more information, because they always view first-time applicants with a little bit more scrutiny than somebody who's returning. And afterwards, we either do the notice of deficiency or we go straight to notice of acceptance, meaning that you've met all the regulatory requirements, but now you need to recruit. There's 15 business days of recruitment, and the idea is we have to make the job available to US workers. So we post it on the state workforce agency website. We send it to any former employees that we may have let go of just for lack of work. And we also use the nearest job center to advertise for us. That's done for a period of 15 days. And if we still don't have workers, or, let's say you have a spot for, or an application for 15 and 2 of those spots are taken, we just reduce that application by 2. So it's not a, done deal for the H-2B. We just reduce it by how many applicants you were able to find. And then we submit a report of recruitment and get our temporary labor certification. A lot of times people think that's the end of the process, but I try to call the temporary labor certification, I just call it the permission slip, because that's really all it is. It's the government giving you a permission slip to then go seek workers. If the cap is open, we move straight from that to the USCIS stage, which is through the Department of Homeland Security. We basically send in our application with the temporary labor certification. We say the DOL has approved it, and then they do a background check on the company. And if there's still spots available, you get a receipt notice and obviously then an approval. We typically file premium processing, meaning we pay a little bit extra. But what happens is you get a response back within 15 days. And afterwards, then you're able to process your workers. So we don't actually name the workers typically until the very end, when we send people to the local consulate to get processed. If the cap isn't open though, and we get through that permission slip phase, and there's no spots available, then we do either in-country recruiting. So for people that maybe are just getting off a contract and are still available, we're able to transfer them into our application, or we get our own cap exempt workers from the season before, if we're talking spring and borrowing season, borrowing workers from the season in the fall prior.
Gotcha. So that's a lot going on there. That's why we have to
Definitely.
hire people like you to handle.
That's the abridged version, unfortunately.
Sure, sure, sure. Well, and it's understandable. I mean, obviously, immigration's a big issue going on right now politically, but it is a big concern, and we want to make sure we do it the proper way, so everything's going through legit. Are there any like typical issues you see come up, or any um, challenges that you see landscapers could face going into this process?
So there are two major, or I would say for landscapers, maybe three major things to always look out for when we, talking about the actual H-2B application. The first one is seasonality. So, we all can see on a logical basis why landscapers would have seasonality, but it's important to have some data to back that up. So if you've been performing at the exact same level for the previous 5 years, every single month, but you would like to ideally expand and create this, pocket of high performance, that's typically going to get scrutinized by the government. New businesses are treated a little bit differently, though, so we can use theoretical information for new businesses. But if you have an existing business and the seasonality just isn't there, you're probably not a great candidate. The other frequent question that gets asked on the notices of deficiency is the justification for the number of workers. So, ideally, we'd want to come up with a number that's very reasonable for the size of the company you have. And we want to correlate it with the amount of work that you have for the upcoming year as well. So, if a company's typically had 5 landscapers every single year, we don't want to suddenly then ask for 45 new people. We want to keep it reasonable to the size of the company, unless you can show that this is the year that your company completely, exploded with new business and we have contracts to back that up. And then the third thing is sometimes it is a little bit difficult if a company is expanding into many different areas geographically to have all those petitions be on one H-2B. So that's something that we can assess beforehand. But the idea is that the work has to be within a communicable distance. So if you're working across state borders, or if you have, some workers 6 hours away from the others, then it might be needed that we'd have 2 applications instead of one, or even multiple applications, depending on the size of the company, meaning that, obviously it is additional cost to the employer.
Gotcha. The one thing I wanted to kind of talk to you about too is, if we get some of these workers in and say one of them is not very good, is not working out, is there anything that we can do to get another replacement person? Or I'm not sure how that works.
Sure. So you can always terminate H-2B employees. That's not an issue. Basically, you just make that decision. You let them know that they've been terminated. You pay for their transportation back home. And then you just report that termination to USCIS and to the DOL. But unfortunately, the way that the H-2B system is set up, there is no replacement. So that means once a spot
Gotcha.
is counted and once a visa is issued under your petition, there is no way to recoup that visa once somebody is gone. And that also includes in country transfers or anything like that. Once that visa has been used, then it's gone for good. That's typically one of the things we try to look out for early on. So we will say to companies to have a little bit of a cushion, because especially if it's your first time and the workers aren't returning and you don't know them very well, it might be wise to have a small margin for those types of circumstances, that you might need to replace somebody, and maybe you leave a spot open until a situation like this arises, and then you're able to do that switch at that point.
Gotcha. Now, what about like housing and all the amenities a person needs if they're coming from another country? What do we need to do to kind of get them all set up?
So sure. Housing is really a question that really depends on the company. Unlike H-2A, for H-2B, you do not have to provide housing. However, if you do, and sometimes it's advised that you do, because the employees coming from other countries don't know what the cost of living is like, and they might be anxious about finding housing or finding something that's affordable within their budget. So a lot of employees will ask for that, or will prefer employers that do have that option. The nice thing about H-2B, though, is it does allow you to deduct the cost of housing from the employee's paychecks. How that works is you'd have to find the housing, or at least have a budget for the housing prior to filing, and then we have to disclose that deduction, on the onset of the application. So if housing is costing you $1,000 every 4 workers every 2 weeks, you can deduct $250 per paycheck from the workers that you have. And the same goes for any amenities that you're also providing in terms of like utilities, phone lines, anything like that, as long as it's disclosed on the onset. So the job order has to contain all that information, and then any US applicant that applies for that same temporary position has to be given the same options as well.
Gotcha. And then as far as like travel, I mean, to and from the wherever they're staying at, to grocery stores and all that stuff, type of stuff, do we have to provide that, or something that they can get through then, driving a company vehicle? How does that kind of work out?
Sure. So the travel requirements are more geared towards the time that they leave their home city till the time that they get to the company, and then from the time they leave the company until the time they go to their home city. Of course, unless they abandon the job site, then you don't have to provide them with housing. I'm sorry, with transportation. But once they arrive to the United States, again, it's a per company decision. Many companies will just have one designated driver, and they'll make sure that they have their driver's license, and then they'll give them use of a company car. But there is no obligation to actually, provide those services. Obviously, it makes for a better environment overall, and more retention, and probably better recruitment results. But in terms of legal obligations, that's not one of the things that's required.
Yeah, I could definitely see that be an advantage where you can allow them to drive a company vehicle. I can tell you our landscape company used a different program, and we actually had to go pick up the person every single morning and bring them back, and go take them to the grocery store. And it just became a hassle as just a business owner, because you have your own personal life that you have to deal with, and now you have to kind of help them out. I'm not trying to downplay it. Everybody has to have human needs, and I get that, but it was just another kind of inconvenience. So allowing them to drive a company vehicle and making sure they have a license is definitely helpful. I can just see from our standpoint.
Sure. And that's one of the questions I get asked a lot when people are looking into, joining the H-2B program, is about the status of people once they get here. Can they get social security cards? Can they get a driver's license? And the answer to both of those questions is yes. Sometimes, local driver's license bureaus don't know the rules, and we have a lot of publications that we're able to help the employer with, and we give them those rules. But a lot of more busy metropolitan areas have dealt with visas before and have no problem issuing driver's licenses to people on H-2B status.
Gotcha. Well, Nataly, is there anything else that a landscaper just needs to really consider when they are looking to go to the H-2B program?
I think one of the things that is a lot of times lost in the initial conversation is that there is a lot of flexibility that's needed if you are going to participate in the H-2B program. So we all have our goals and what we'd like to see in terms of how many workers we're going to get, and what day they're going to arrive, and all those details. But especially your first round of applying for H-2Bs, the process is not always very smooth. And I always tell my employers, to hold on. And after the first season, you'll feel a little bit more stability. And then once you've done it a few times, it just becomes a very, very well-balanced program, and something that, I know companies have relied on for 15, 20 years now, and they have the same workers back for many of them. But when we're talking about your first time filing, there has to be a little bit of flexibility. And, let's say, for example, you'd like landscapers from Mexico, but the cap is closed, and there's supplemental visas available from El Salvador, then, we have to be able to pivot and accept new things as they come. And then, maybe reassess our plans in a year, or in 6 months when the new cap opens. But things like that, I think, are important. And, also having good documentation is very important. And then once you get your H-2B workers, one of the compliance requirements is keeping records. So that's also very important. So, I would designate one person to be the H-2B contact at every company, and they're the ones that are, learning the H-2B regulations. And one of the things I strive for is teaching my employees, let me just kind of go. One of the things that I strive for is teaching my clients about the H-2B program so that they can make informed decisions for themselves and, not have the firm decide everything for them. So I think having one person that's very immersed in it does really help make the process more smooth for everybody.
We want to take a quick second to tell you about our friends over at Cycle CPA. I can't even express to you how important it is to have a good accountant on your side. You know you want accurate bookkeeping and financial statements every month. Instead, you're often left with limited time to focus on the accounting side of your business and no reports to show for it. At Cycle CPA, the landscaping accountants, they not only handle the bookkeeping, but also provide landscape industry benchmarking, job costing, financials by service line, advisory meetings, and much more. Cycle CPA has a team of landscaping accountants available to provide anything from bookkeeping to CFO services. Visit cyclecpa.com, and for $100 off, mention the $1 Million Landscaper podcast.
Are you tired of those spam calls about your online presence and website? I know you're nodding your head right now. Finding a company that knows the details about the lawn and landscape industry can be difficult. Well, I have a solution for you. Let me introduce you to Green Frog Web Design. We all know growing your business in our digital age requires an effective online presence, a website geared towards bringing in new customers. With fierce competition and a never-ending line of chucking the trucks ready to take your place, DIYing your online presence is not a serious option for growing businesses. Find a trustworthy and effective solution with Green Frog Web Design. Oh, and by the way, the first month for a new website is $1. Link is in the bio.
EasyBeasy's easy to use, easy to learn, affordable work order and time clock app with unlimited users included with every subscription. If you've ever struggled with the daily grind of keeping track of work orders, you have to check out EasyBeasy. Make and edit work orders anytime, anywhere you're working, at your desk, in your truck, on the job site, even on your couch. With EasyBeasy, you can easily copy work orders to use over and over, which is great for mowing and plowing. You can also keep track of employee timesheets, contact your customers, add notes, instructions, even pictures of your jobs. EasyBeasy works on Android and Apple devices or any tablet or computer. EasyBeasy also has a wide variety of reports so you can have all the info you need for billing right from your phone. Say goodbye to paying for extra users because everyone gets unlimited users on EasyBeasy. Try EasyBeasy for free for 30 days. Visit easybeasy.app/MDL to sign up. EasyBeasy is a simple work order and time clock app for mow crews, hardscape crews, and everything in between. Start saving time and money with EasyBeasy. Visit easybeasy.app/MDL to sign up today. That makes sense. Now, when should a landscaper start trying to file and go through the application process, especially like this season's already kind of getting towards the end now. But say they want to hire somebody for like next spring. When do we need to start that process?
Sure. So typically I advise at least 150 days before your date of need for the spring season, because it is very competitive. We typically like to start our applications anywhere between mid-September, where we're filing the prevailing wages, up until the latest, I would say, is very early November. So we do have quite a bit of time. The earlier you file, though, you do get advantages in the fact that, let's say a prevailing wage does come back a little bit high, we're able to adjust and then refile and still make it in time for that January 1st deadline of when your actual application has to go through, because you're not allowed to file until your prevailing wage is back. And that also allows us to write a more strong statement of need and be able to have all the evidence on the onset. So instead of playing defense when we get the notice of deficiency, we have all the information, right away. And because with the spring filing, especially, the cap is so competitive, 1 or 2 days of you just responding to that notice of deficiency can make a big difference of whether you're going to make the cap or not. So the more information you have, in your initial application, the better it ends up being. However, all that to be, said is we do have emergency situations sometimes where all of a sudden a company has a large contract and they're unable to fill it. The H-2B program does allow for emergency filings, but those are, infrequently granted. So I would only use them in extreme circumstances.
Gotcha. So, well, I mean, this might lead in, I guess, somewhat into the next question would be, if they've already, they brought on some workers and it's getting towards the end of the season where they typically would end their contract. Say they happen to get another contract, can they continue having the same workers, or is that contract over at that point and they have to refile, or how's that go?
So there are different situations. One of them is where we could do an extension. So let's say that, we have a new contract that's at the tail end of our existing one. We might be able to do a one-time extension. And basically, we say this was unforeseeable. Here are the reasons. And typically, they look for things like weather events, market fluctuations, something that's really outside the employer's hands. So, for example, I had a large client before where all of a sudden there was a tornado and they needed to provide lumber for 15 different across 15 different states and major areas. And, the only way to do that was to work through January, which they typically would have their workers back home. Well, we were able to file an extension in that circumstance and have them, continue working then. Or if we have an uncharacteristically warm summer where, the grass is still growing and past when it typically does, and it needs more maintenance or something like that, that would be a situation where we could possibly file an extension. We can also then file a different type of application. So, in some circumstances, the landscaper position may not be available, but we might have something like tree trimming, for example, where that's more prevalent in the fall going on to winter because of the different storms. So we could have the workers stay here, but transfer from one application type to another, or we can have them transfer to a different location. So if one season has ended in let's say in northern Michigan, where it gets cold pretty quickly, but we have some work in North Carolina, we are able to transfer them from one location to another.
Gotcha. Now, is there like an idea of what a landscaper could expect to pay for like a service like this? I'm not sure if it's per person or how it's all laid out, but is there an idea like a price range or anything?
Sure. So every law office does it differently. In terms of let's say just government fees, the step to get to the temporary labor certification typically does not cost the employer anything out of pocket in addition to whatever they're paying their attorney to process the fee. And then once you get to that stage, you do have to pay the I-129 fee. It is quite expensive depending on how many workers you have. So they have a staggered fee depending on if you're 25 full-time workers or more, or if you're 25 workers and less. And the fee does, vary quite a bit depending on the company size. In addition, we do have to pay premium processing because otherwise the application would take about 4 or 5 months to go from being filed to actually being approved, and by then your season is over. So that's an additional cost. And then there is a consular processing cost of $205, as I believe right now. The latest figure was at the Department of State per worker that they are charging to process the cases. At my firm, I charge a flat fee for filing the application. So that doesn't matter if you're asking for 100 workers or for 2. And then I charge a consular processing fee per worker because then obviously it's taking us more time to collect all those workers' information and apply for them, and also arrange for travel if needed, and send check-in documents, which make sure that, the employee has signed off on receiving all refunds that they were supposed to, and given all the tools and things like that they were supposed to once arriving to the U.S.
Gotcha. Now, I know you mentioned there's a cap, and I believe you said it was 33,000 people. So basically, if I understand this correctly, so once that cap is kind of filled, you can no longer get any more employees, right? After that is filled?
Correct. It's 33,000 per season for a total of 66,000 a year. Half of those visas are released October 1st, and the other half is released April 1st. The last few years, they have had what's called a supplemental cap, and it's essentially a bonus round of visas that they've issued. They've almost doubled the number of visas every single season, and they've reserved certain visas for just people from the Northern Triangle companies, being countries, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and lately Costa Rica. And the idea is, the government has realized those 66,000 a year is not enough, so they have added additional visas. And for most of the companies I've dealt with the supplemental cap, they've gotten what they've needed. However, you still have the options, if the cap is met, of either getting cap exempt workers or in-country transfers. So that means if a company has workers and they no longer need them for that full season, right around the time your season is starting, you can transfer those workers to you. Or you can have workers that came in under the first half and left come back to your company, whether they're yours or not, actually. But because the exemption is carried with the worker and not with the company. So any worker that's come on a visa now in October, for example, would be cap exempt for next April, whether they're working for you or for anybody else. So that would be the other option. Otherwise, yes, once the visas are filled, the government isn't going to issue anymore after that cap has been met.
Mm-hmm. So the question just kind of popped in my head is, if a landscaper goes to this program, I know you mentioned a couple different countries they can come from. What if the employer does not speak that language? Do you have any suggestions on what they can do to overcome that?
Sure. So, this is a very, very common thing that happens. Typically, we try to have one person in the company as a representative that does speak, some of the foreign language, or we try to find one person in the group that's coming that speaks English. So, we try to do it one or the other. For example, one of the countries that we very frequently bring in landscapers from is Mexico. So we try to find, one person in Mexico that speaks English with a group of 5 or 6 people, and then they're able to facilitate most of that contact. Or we try to have, one person, whether they're in HR or a foreman, if it's a construction company or something like that speaks Spanish. Or what we can do, and this really again depends on the cap and on the different availabilities, is we can try to recruit from English speaking countries as well. So some of our companies come to us and they say, we have nobody that speaks Spanish and we absolutely want somebody that speaks English. And then, there's certain countries, like for example, Costa Rica has more English speakers, when we're talking about labor level than Mexico. So then we move from recruiting in Mexico to recruiting in Costa Rica, for example.
Gotcha. The one thing too, I know when we spoke the first time, you mentioned that there are other possibilities too for hiring in, and you said it's not so prominent in the landscaping realm, but bringing in someone for the admin side of things too. You mind sharing just a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the common things used is the TN visa, which is through the NAFTA trade agreement. And basically what that is anybody from Mexico or Canada that has certain specialties, and there's a list of those specialties that's already published and easily accessible. Anybody that falls into those categories, typically like accountants, engineers, a lot of like admin level roles, you would be able to have come from either Mexico or Canada. And the nice thing about that process is they do let you negotiate directly with the person. So you don't have to go through the prevailing wage process. We don't have to go through, all these steps of getting a labor certification. It's a one-time approval for the worker based on the offer letter that you gave them. So what they're testing is, does the worker have qualifications that are relevant to the job, and is that job in the listed list of approved positions that's available for these visas. So it becomes a very streamlined way of getting workers compared to, the long-term routes. Then there is also the green card route. So, typically we don't advise for a company to file for green cards for, applicants that they don't know very well, but maybe once you've had your workers a couple of seasons, or maybe, if it's a high level admin, we're able to have the company sponsor them directly. And it does take a few years depending on what level of requirements that we have, and whether it's it's considered unskilled labor or skilled labor with 2 years, or something that's a professional job. But typically it does take a few years, but at the end you have a permanent worker that's here on a green card and that can work for you as long as you both agree on it. So those are some of the most common options for companies. And then there's also an H-1B program, which again does require a specialty occupation. And there is a lottery for that as well. But it is a possibility for jobs that are not seasonal in the way that H-2Bs are. So it's for 3-year contracts that can be renewed for up to another 3 years. So you can get 6 years of work from that, but you can't have certain occupations under that visa program again. So we do have to make sure it's a specialty occupation, and landscape laborers typically don't fall under H-1B.
Gotcha. One thing I know too, we were talking about, and this is kind of not talked about a whole lot in the at least in podcasts and stuff, at least that I'm aware of. If the employer currently has somebody that is undocumented, is there anything that they can do to help them to become a documented worker?
Sure. So there's a few options. It's honestly, not a lot. It depends on how long they've been here, and if they have any other possible statuses like DACA, or if they're here on TPS or something like that. And in many jurisdictions, we're able to help them get advanced parole and leave the country with this, again, permission slip, for lack of a better word, to come back. And once they come back, it erases the unlawful stay that they've, accrued over that time. The other option, and it's something that's actually, just was enjoined on Monday of this week and started last week, is parole in place for people that are spouses of U.S. citizens. And there's also military parole in place. So if you have an immediate family member that's in the military, you might be able to get re-paroled without leaving the country. And then also, in very limited circumstances, if somebody's only overstayed their visa for a very short duration, they might be able to apply for the H-2B program and get processed overseas and through the consulate and come back. However, that really does require a lot of attorney oversight. So, I don't suggest anybody does that without really delving into the fine details of their, situation.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. And like I said, I have spoken to some people that have had some of those workers, and like, well, it's it's not necessarily the best situation to be in, but that's why I kind of want to kind of pick your brain and see what you had to say
Sure.
about that.
And really, when it comes to that, there's like a little bit of different viewpoint on whether the person has entered lawfully and was inspected and then later overstayed their visa, or somebody that, completely bypassed that and entered unlawfully, because the solutions are different depending on which one it is. One of the things I suggest to my employers that have similar situations is, let's start looking at the family, and let's start looking at what they have within their family that might be a faster route. Instead of like, if somebody's married to a U.S. citizen, it might be easier to help them adjust their status through their U.S. citizen spouse versus through the company, but with the company's help, because a lot of times, obviously, there's limitations to being able to pay legal fees and adjustment fees and the different application filing fees. So a lot of times, my suggestion is, let's look at the individual, let's look at their family and their individual situation. And then as a last resort, consider if there's something that the company can directly sponsor them for.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Now, if anybody is considering to do the H-2B program, they're still just kind of unsure, they're not sure they're the right fit or whatnot, what suggestions do you have?
So, one of the things they can do is book a consultation with me on my website, www.mualemfirm.com. There is a tab where you can book a consultation, and I'm more than happy to chat about it and see if you're a good fit. The questions, maybe to ask yourself, though, is, can I prove that there are certain months out of the year in which my need is a little bit different than the other months? And if yes, what documents do I have to show for that? And then I would also consider how much work you have lined up for the season and, kind of come ready to discuss those things. And sometimes, what you think is a no could be a yes, because of the nuances of the regulations. But generally speaking, those are the two major questions that, I think if we have positive answers to both of those things, then you're probably a good fit for the H-2B program.
So, Nataly, I know you mentioned a little bit again, but would you mind just sharing one more time, like where a person can reach out to you, a phone number and whatnot to kind of get the process going? Because I know, like you said, it's getting close to the time they need to start filing. So if you're really considering it, get on that
Yes.
application process now.
Sure. The best way to reach me is through my website, www.mualemfirm.com. And then I also can be very easily reached via email, and it's my full name, Nataly Mualem at mualemfirm.com. And my phone number is 216-312-4700. And you can schedule a call at any time, whether it's through the website or email or even through phone. And I'm more than happy to provide some initial evidence, some initial conversation to talk about your evidence and whether you qualify for seasonality.
So one thing I want to share with the audience members, we actually have a person that's in our coaching program. They actually hired another firm, not Nataly's firm, but hired another firm, and they're just running some issues. And Nataly kind of pointed out that it may not have been the person's fault. It may not have been the firm's fault. It might have been the cap issue and stuff like that without going into it. But my thought is if you're looking into this program and considering this program, reach out to a couple different people, just like you do with anybody else. Reach out to these people, reach out to Nataly, and just do your own research and make sure you're a good fit. They seem like a good person. That's one thing I liked about Nataly. It's kind of a more personalized fit rather than some of these bigger firms. So I appreciate you sharing all your knowledge here, Nataly. This is great stuff. And I hope everybody takes advantage of it and reaches out to you to at least start the process or get asking the right questions to you to make sure that's a good fit.
Of course. And
So,
again, like this is, I think, my words of advice are give it time. The H-2B program sometimes isn't a magic pill that's going to solve all your labor needs in the first run. But I've had, a lot of experience with employers that have said it's really transformed their business. And I actually just got off the phone with an employer today who is a landscaping company in Indiana. And she was telling me how much it's really just been a game changer for them and how their revenue's gone up, and they found some of the best workers that they've ever had because of the H-2B program, and it really added stability. I think that's the one thing that probably employers are trying to aim for is some stability and being able to scale while having confidence that the workforce will be there. So it's one of those things that I do advise you be a little bit patient with. Of if you don't get all your workers on April 1st, the first time you apply, it doesn't mean that the program is completely a bad fit for you. It could just, take a few, runs and tweaks, and then you'll get there. If you have the underlying seasonality and, some patience, I think it's a great fix for many of the labor issues that we're seeing. And, I've again had employers that have, that I've talked to that have done this for 15, 20 years plus, and they have the same group of workers come back each time. And the nice thing about it is, you are able to be very selective when you recruit from outside the US. So you can get amazing quality workers with a lot of experience. And, there's no shortage of those workers. I'm on a lot of message boards, and you can see every day people posting their resumes and their, credentials asking for a job in the US. So definitely a lot of opportunities out there. Just be a little bit patient and, maybe start small and grow your H-2B presence with time instead of, again, treating it as like a magic pill that's going to maybe transform things overnight.
I love hearing that. That is great because I know it is a big issue in this industry right now, and everybody's trying to, like, I see it on our Facebook groups and all these different Facebook groups. How do I find people? How can I get good people? Well,
Sure.
Here's another option for you. So Thank you, Natalie. I appreciate you being on the show today, and I look forward to having you on the future. We can kind of continue this conversation because I know it's so important. And like, guys, we can go on for hours with this, but we want to make sure everybody can take it in and absorb a little bit of time and move forward. So thank you again, Natalie.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.